Support for the Blueprint podcast comes from the SANS Institute. Are you a new Blue Team member or SOC analyst looking to make sense of the vast variety of data that you see on a day-to-day basis? Are you working in a SOC that's plagued with alerts that are constantly bothering you with false positives or repetitive action? If so, I know that pain. I remember being an analyst and walking into the SOC and thinking everything was going to be great, and then realizing, oh, we have some serious problems here. I've dealt with those problems over the course of my long career, and the results of what I've learned have been summarized in my brand new course, SEC 450 Blue Team Fundamentals. If you're a new SOC analyst looking to get a grapple on all of the network and host data that you interact with, improve your analysis technique, learn how to reverse engineer malicious file types that you commonly see in phishing or downloaded from the internet, or just get rid of those pain points from the average SOC, like repetitive actions, drowning in tickets, alert fatigue, SEC 450 is the class for you. Check this course out at sansurl.com/450. Hope to see you in class.
This is the Blueprint Podcast, bringing you the latest in cyber defense and security operations from top Blue Team leaders. Blueprint is brought to you by the SANS Institute and is hosted by SANS Certified Instructor, John Hubbard. And now, here's your host, John Hubbard.
PowerShell is an incredibly useful tool available to all Blue Teamers, but many people avoid it. You should not be avoiding PowerShell, and today on the episode, we make the case for why. We have Josh Johnson, an expert in PowerShell, to explain why you should learn PowerShell, how to set yourself up for success, Blue Team uses for PowerShell like hunting and detection and log analysis, how to stop and detect attacker usage of PowerShell, integration and automation options, and much, much more. All that today on the Blueprint Podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Blueprint Podcast. Today on the show, I've got Josh Johnson. I met Josh a few years ago at the first ever SANS Blue Team Summit, I believe, and we've crossed paths at a number of events ever since then. Got to work with him on the Blue Team curriculum here at SANS, and along the way, I've been lucky enough to soak up a lot of Josh's kind of talent and wisdom along the way. And I wanted to bring Josh on the podcast today so that he could share that with the listeners and the audience. So welcome to the podcast, Josh.
Thanks for having me, John. I love the show, so I'm happy to be here.
Fantastic. So more specifically, Josh, of course, you know, I brought you on because over the last few years, you became certified SANS instructor and course author and wrote a course on a topic that I think everyone on the Blue Team definitely needs to know about, but not everyone does. And that is PowerShell. PowerShell is one of those things that I know for myself, at least, I was seeming a little bit foreign, a little bit intimidating. I kind of wondered, is this for someone else? Is it for me as a Blue Teamer? And especially for those who are, used to the Linux command line, it can be a little bit weird, but I think it's weird in an awesome way. And so, Josh, I wanted to have you on so that you can explain to everyone all of the awesome uses of PowerShell and why people should look into it, especially for defensive tasks, and how to use it as part of the typical defense. So let's jump in with some early kind of broad questions here. What makes PowerShell kind of special and unique compared to some of the other programming languages and kind of scripting options that are out there?
Sure. So PowerShell is unique, compared to some of the more traditional command lines, and especially in terms of Windows environments, right? We haven't grown up in Windows land with a really solid command line that we can use and build automation around. And PowerShell really changed the game in terms of Windows administration from the command line. And while it was certainly not built as a Blue Team tool, I found just countless use cases in terms of how we can take this automation engine and the scripting language and solve Blue Team problems with it. And I really got involved in PowerShell. I was a total novice, and I was rolling out AppLocker for an organization. And I started rolling out AppLocker, and I'm opening Event Viewer, connecting to another computer and looking at event logs on this computer to see what type of AppLocker events are happening on this computer. And what I quickly realized was this doesn't scale across 10,000 machines or 100,000 machines or however big this organization is. And so I had to automate it. There's no other solution there. And so I jumped into PowerShell as, I'd heard Windows sysadmins love it, and I had no idea how it works. So I started playing around and quickly was able to kind of consolidate those events from those different systems and, make useful assumptions and analysis on that data. And what turned from a highly manual process really turned into scripting that was repeatable across multiple organizations in my experience. I've shared the code I've built with multiple organizations and like, wow, this just made rolling out AppLocker, which was this beast of a project, something that is accessible and actually kind of simple and straightforward, right? I still have to look at the logs. I still have to understand what runs on the system, but in terms of aggregating, gathering the data and making sense of it, that stuff can all be automated for me. And so that was kind of my initial foray into PowerShell. And then I just fell in love with it. And I was like, well, if it solves this problem, what other blue team things can I do with it? And, the obsession just kind of started there and has since grown.
Very cool. Yeah, it sounds like it's incredibly useful in terms of a time saver and all that, which of course we're all looking to be able to do. How much PowerShell do you think a person would need to know in terms of like, can I be useful in a day, a week, a month? Like what's roughly the amount of time it would take someone to go from zero to useful for something?
Yeah, so not that much time, honestly. PowerShell looks a bit intimidating to a newcomer because you sometimes see these really complex one-liners that are, multiple chain commands. And one kind of fun thing about PowerShell is the command names are extremely verbose and they can be really long. So, it's not like the traditional Linux command line that you're used to. It are these long chain commands with tons of parameters, pipes between each other. And it looks intimidating. And that might be the point where someone looks at it and they're like, look, this is clearly something extremely advanced. I don't want to pursue it and stop there. And in reality, the verbosity of those command names and things like that are actually really useful from a blue team perspective. I can easily look at a command and figure out what it does. And I can find commands. And based on those names, I can figure out, at least a gist of what that command is meant to do for me.
Yeah, it's an interesting format. It always has the verb noun kind of commandlet string, which I thought was really weird going into it. But once I got used to it myself, I was kind of like, oh, this is actually really useful. One of the other things I want to spell out explicitly for the listeners, if they haven't used PowerShell before, is can you describe the difference of like the output of a PowerShell command compared to like Linux command line and like objects versus text and why that's a useful thing?
Yeah, sure. So Jeffrey Snover, the inventor of PowerShell, I think he called it prayer-based parsing in terms of traditional command lines and how the output of you could pipe commands together, but the output of one command being served as the input to another command was purely text-based. And we'd have to parse that text to make use of it, to properly format it before using that input into another command. And what PowerShell does that's unique, and what some folks see as a performance issue with PowerShell, and I can talk more on that in a second, is everything is object-based. And I have a computer science background, so I kind of grew up on these object-oriented programming concepts. So it was really kind of intuitive, personally, with my background, to jump into this format of output of commands. But everything is an object, and so you'll find commands like get member that allow you to inspect an object, and you can see different properties and methods that are available on an object. And why that's useful for blue teams is because, if I want to look at processes on a system, I can run the get process commandlet, and it returns process objects to me. And those process objects, just at the console, right, I see a few of those properties that are available to me. But under the hood, the output actually contains tons and tons of properties and methods that I can use. And so these properties describe attributes of the object. So for example, the process name, the process ID, those are all properties. And they also have methods available. So if I want to kill a process, for example, there's a kill method, and I can call that process objects.kill method and kill the process. And so, it's deeply integrated with the OS, but there's also this object-oriented nature of it. And why this is really, really nice, and why sometimes the complex one-liners look highly complex, is because we're doing things like filtering out different object properties to pass to other commands. So if I want to get a process and then pass it to the stop process commandlet, I can say, hey, give me the process where it's PowerShell. And I can pass it to stop process, and I can pass the name based on the property of the object that I'm looking at. And so it becomes really easy, rather than saying like, parsing with a native command line tool, I can just say, give me the property called name, and that's what I want to use on the pipeline. And so this object-oriented nature of PowerShell really gives us a lot of flexibility and a lot of consistency, right? There's nothing worse for a blue team than we have an incident responding to, and my code doesn't work. Like, John, I know you've been here. I know you've been there where like someone's breathing down your neck, like fix the problem, like, cut this thing off, and you're troubleshooting code. Like that's a situation no one wants to be in. And,
Not fun.
right. And given the consistency of this object-oriented output and input, we have the ability to really write reliable code.
That's one of the things I noticed is once I grasped that concept is like getting really down in the weeds stuff done was a matter of just chaining things together, and it almost worked like magic. And I was like, wow, this is so much better than the Linux command line. I'm amazed that everyone isn't just all over this. And so that's definitely one of the reasons I wanted to have you on, to explain all the amazing things PowerShell can do. So if people hopefully are sold on, okay, I want to learn PowerShell, what are the first things they need to do to set themselves up for success? Because I know there's a bunch of different versions. PowerShell runs in different places. Like, how would you set up a station, a set of tools for wanting to dive into learning PowerShell?
Yeah, sure. So, one of the nice things about PowerShell is that on modern Windows operating systems, we have Windows PowerShell available to us. And so versioning is a little bit complex with more recent versions, right? Windows PowerShell was the original iteration of PowerShell and has since transformed into a cross-platform language. And so we started with Windows PowerShell. From my perspective, when I was tackling that AppLocker project years ago, that was a draw for me, was that, okay, it's already there. Like all these Windows boxes already have PowerShell there. I can just use this as a means to connect to them with its native remoting capabilities and get the data with tools that are already on the system. Since then, PowerShell has gone cross-platform. And now we have, when Windows PowerShell was kind of sunsetted, PowerShell Core was the next iteration. And now we have PowerShell 7. And the idea is that we can run both side by side, and I do that on all my workstations, right? I have Windows PowerShell kind of natively there in my Windows box, and then I have PowerShell 7 for some of the newer and more advanced features that the PowerShell project's coming out with. And some of the great things there is that now I can do SSH-based remoting, and I can use PowerShell to connect to my Linux systems using PowerShell as the means of all of my automation, but I'm using SSH to connect in. And so, we can get really flexible. So what I would recommend in terms of getting started is both versions, right? Windows PowerShell 5.1 and then PowerShell 7 or whatever the latest version is when you're listening to this episode here. And that'll give you the best of both worlds. You'll have the cutting edge features of PowerShell 7 or the modern version, and also kind of all of the native built-in stuff that goes around with Windows PowerShell. And then beyond that, I recommend just a really solid development environment, and I would recommend VS Code there, Visual Studio Code. Windows PowerShell used to ship with PowerShell Ice, which was just fine in terms of a development environment. But in terms of the more modern features and getting the best bang for your buck in terms of a development environment, I highly recommend VS Code. And then from there, you can install the relevant extensions, PowerShell extension, any other tooling you might want. And that can integrate with source control, right? From a blue team perspective, source control should be really important. We want to share code across a team. We should work in source control that allows us to work off of kind of a production branch of code where we know this thing's going to work. We can work on that code and make improvements. When it hits the fan and we have to respond, I want to have like a really reliable version of that script or that tool that I'm going to use, and dive into that working version of code.
Okay. Yeah. So that's definitely one thing that I think would be non-obvious. So I'm glad you were able to spell out the Git 5.1 and 7, right? That's something I didn't even know the difference between. So let's get into some specific use cases for PowerShell. And there's a ton of them. So I'm going to try to scope it down here. First, let's talk some blue team stuff. Then we'll talk maybe detection of red team stuff. In the blue team use case world, let's say we're working in a SOC. We are trying to use PowerShell for kind of early stage in an attack, kind of detection oriented things. How can PowerShell help us do that?
Yeah, so from an initial triage perspective, like I'm in a SOC and I have a Suricata alert, and by itself, those things only mean so much, and I need more context. And PowerShell is my go-to utility. I love EDRs, I love that type of tooling, but PowerShell is really my go-to utility when I need more, and it gives me the ability to quickly access the system and pull back relevant information. And so, Sec 586, you mentioned the PowerShell course. One of our first labs that we do in that course is a triage lab where basically, we don't know much about this system. Let's get some basic context that will help us triage whatever alert or whatever hunt data came out that I'm trying to triage to understand, is this just anomalous activity? Is it malicious? Is it nothing to worry about? And so, from a triage perspective, it gives me the ability to both, if I need to, just get hands-on keyboard on that system that I'm trying to triage, but also I can build kind of pre-packaged triage scripts or triage tooling that gives me the ability to say, I know no matter what the situation is, I'm always going to want one of these few things, like running processes, network information, everything from like the ARP table on the system to running processes to services or files on that system. And what I like to do is pre-build all of that. And I know, from like a notebook perspective or an automation perspective, I could put that into my SOAR tool. I could put that into a notebook that my teams can use to basically say, hey, even if you're an entry-level SOC analyst, you have no idea what this PowerShell does, fill out this variable that gives you the machine name, press play, and we're off to the races. The console will fill out with some data that will provide you that context. And so, I could talk days, obviously, on blue team use cases. So at a high level, I think triage and that initial analysis is really a great place to start from blue team PowerShell use cases.
I got a bunch of awesome follow-up questions, I think, on just that alone. One of the first things people might be wondering is, so you're just connecting directly to a machine that might be infected? How does that work? And is that safe?
Yeah, so, that's a very common question, right? We don't want to just like RDP into potentially compromised workstations. We don't want to affect the integrity of that system. Depending on the target system, depending on how we do authentication, we can use Kerberos-based PowerShell remoting to access that system in a way that's protective of the credentials on that box. And, we don't want to just be handing over tier 1, tier 2 credentials to an attacker who's just sitting there waiting for them. And so that's a very valid question. And with PowerShell remoting, we have the ability to kind of do this in a safe manner that gives us the ability to interrogate that system without overly disclosing those credentials. Now, in Sec 586, we talk about those techniques like, do I want this adversary on the system to know that I'm in here poking around? And we'll talk about those same type of techniques as well. But in terms of credential safety, again, depending on the environment, depending on the configuration of those systems, we can do this safely.
Another question that kind of springs to my mind on that is, when you're going to do that initial triage, what is it about this data that you and maybe the answer is you do both of these in reality, but why jump straight to like the PowerShell sources of data that you mentioned, as opposed to your SIM and the things that are supposed to do, security log collection? What is it that you're going for specifically with PowerShell that you don't get from other security tools? Maybe is that question.
No, it's a great question. And I think it really depends heavily on the environment where you're working. If my SIM has all the endpoint logs already pulled into it, and, maybe the local Windows firewall logs already being pulled into the SIM, and I have sysmon or EDR that's giving me really granular information about the state of that system, maybe I do start there, and that's where I do my initial triage. What I found, though, is there's and maybe this is just me, but I always want more. I always need more context and more information. That's when I'll kind of pivot. So it really depends, working with organizations smaller size, maybe they don't have as much of a footprint in terms of security tooling. Maybe there is no SIM, there is no EDR. That's where I think we can fill the gap. And even when we do have all that tooling, again, I've always found the need to, let me go grab that file and take a closer look at it. And use other techniques that are PowerShell based to go get that data.
Very cool. So the data you go and pull, right, it's in these easy to use kind of objects in memory that you can manipulate and maybe look for trends and other kind of stuff that might help tell you if something bad is happening, right? And in the most convenient way possible, I'm assuming is why you're approaching it with PowerShell as opposed to maybe some of these other ones. What are some of the searches you find yourself doing with PowerShell that are like very, very easy to do? Like, what's your go-to kind of play in some of these situations, for example?
Yeah, one thing, and I mentioned this earlier, and I'm glad that you just reminded me to come back to it. One thing that I find is a common complaint about PowerShell is its performance. And it really comes back to this kind of object-oriented nature of the platform. And especially when I'm doing triage across tons and tons of systems, if I don't scope those queries or the commands that I'm running properly, basically with PowerShell remoting, what we're doing is we're kind of taking these objects turning them into XML, sending them across the wire, and turning them back into PowerShell objects on the remote system. And that process, as you can imagine, if it were just text, would be one thing, but it's these really full-featured objects that I'm working with. And if I don't scope what properties I need and things like that to properly, pull back only what I need, we will feel that performance hit. And so what I like to do, and again, I mentioned we can talk about the notebook thing here in a second. What I like to do is basically pre-build these queries that say, hey, show me all logins where this username is associated with the login. And there's special ways that we can do that with get when event, which is PowerShell's log grabbing tool. We can pass certain filters that say only show me this event if these various fields match what I'm looking for. And so I can say, hey, I know this system is exhibiting strange behavior. We saw this user log into it. Show me anywhere else that this user's logged in on the subnet or whatever zone that I'm looking within on that network. And so I like to kind of stage these things and just say, hey, replace the username here, let it rip, and it'll return all the relevant information. One other thing I really like, and I shared this one of the other courses I teach, Sec 530, the security architecture class. We talk a lot about building a defensible security architecture, and one of the things that I've shared that I find folks are constantly reaching out and they're like, that just saved me, is this PowerShell profile trick that I use that looks at all logins on the local system and then just groups them by the users who are logging in. And what I have all of my admins do is say, hey, make this your PowerShell profile. So whenever you start a new PowerShell session, the first thing that pops up is here are the users who have logged into the system. And, like the UBA tools and all that do a good job, but there's nothing better than an admin who says that user account should never have logged into this system. And just by popping it up, like making it in the admin's face, I've found this to just be tremendously powerful. It's so simple. It's like literally a one-liner that you throw in your PowerShell profile, and it shows you who's logged into the system. And I've had so many folks reach out like, wow, that seemed like such a silly trick, but it really worked. This admin just told me that his machine's compromised.
Yeah, that's really cool. I never even thought about that, but yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One of the other things I think we kind of tangentially hit there, but maybe didn't spell out explicitly that's useful to say is PowerShell is not just connecting from one machine to one other machine, right? Can you explain a little bit about the capability to do like fan out and how that would help you maybe sweep an entire organization for some of these things?
Yeah, the fan out remoting capability is native to PowerShell remoting. So, you don't really have to write any custom code to kind of do this sort of asynchronous and parallel connections to target systems. Instead, you just say, go do this command against these systems. And PowerShell under the hood is going to throttle that if you have tons and tons of systems to whatever kind of parallel execution that you want, but in reality it's going to be hitting those systems simultaneously. And so if you watch on the wire what it looks like when you're using PowerShell remoting, you'll see connections going to multiple systems and that data coming back asynchronously. So it's not just waiting for system one to respond before it reaches out to the second system. And that gives us the ability to really scale everything from hardening to detection to response. I can quickly make ground on a large network given this native kind of fan out remoting.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I thought was super cool that maybe we don't emphasize enough is like, it's not just a one-to-one like an SSH connection is. It's like you can tell everything to look for something and get the response back, which is obviously incredibly powerful, like you said, for response and everything. On that topic for response, we just talked a little bit about data sources and detection, but what about when you do find something and you want to go for containment? What type of things do you find yourself using PowerShell for kind of in that realm?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a huge fan of the local host-based firewall, Windows firewall, and on Windows workstations. I think in most of the organizations that I've worked with, it's underutilized. And if you're a red teamer and you bump up against an organization where the host-based firewall is really well utilized, like it can throw some headaches into your normal operations. It can be really, really powerful. And I like to use it from a response perspective too. So I want to contain some system or I want to make, maybe I'm on some critical network and I can't just start pulling the plug on stuff. Well, I can just push a firewall rule that says, hey, don't allow any connections from this neighbor who we know is now at least deemed suspicious, if not, confirmed malicious. And in the meantime, kind of minimize business impact that with this sort of containment, but also, restrict the ability of that threat actor on that system from jumping to the neighbors on the local network. Things like private VLANs and these really architecture-specific network controls that mitigate things like workstation to workstation communication can be done fairly easily and fairly safely. I'll say fairly safely, depending on the software you run, in terms of PowerShell automation. And we can push these sorts of quick firewall rules and down to systems to quickly mitigate that impact. That's kind of my go-to on the network. And then from an operating system perspective, it really depends on the type of threat that we're responding to. And one tool that I love, my buddy Mick Douglas wrote this tool called Pause Process. And what it does is it attaches a built-in Windows debugger to a running process. And when you use this tool, basically, if there's something running and it's executing against target systems or the target operating system, and you attach this debugger, it just halts it. It just pauses it. And ideally, in the best case scenario, when I've used it, that is some malicious process that's facilitating command and control. And, we just kind of contain this by pausing a process, not doing too much harm to that system. We're not pulling the plug or anything like that. And it's, again, using all built-in Windows tools. We don't need any special kind of EDR type containment for this. We just use built-in Windows tools facilitated by PowerShell automation to contain that threat.
I've seen him demonstrate that. That's like a super, super cool thing that he has there. Yeah, PowerShell does some really incredible, powerful stuff, right? Hence the name. That being said, right, moving maybe from blue into red team stuff, it's powerful for us, but of course, it's also powerful for those who want to do evil things in our environment with its multitude of capabilities. We could probably break this down into two pieces as well. Before we get into detection of bad things that already happened, I know there's a lot of people that always ask about well, how do I lock down PowerShell in my environment so attackers can't use it? What type of prevention controls are there that exist for the PowerShell language?
Yeah, so I've seen two approaches for this. One I don't like and one I really like. The first one that I don't like is I go into a lot of organizations and I see EDR rules or app locker rules or application control rules that say block PowerShell.exe. And that has been proven time and time again to be ineffective. We can't just block the execution of the specific executable. To get even a little bit more granular, the system automation DLL, that PowerShell uses under the hood. I've seen folks try to block that as well. And there's just so many bypasses to that approach that I don't find it to be a feasible option. Sure, if there's some, macro in a Word document that ends up calling PowerShell, maybe we've mitigated that. But to some determined adversary, who wants to bring their own version of PowerShell or bring their own version of that DLL, it's only so effective. And that way, that's the reason I like to go this other route where we don't block PowerShell, but we control it. And what I really like to do is just use the native capabilities of PowerShell under the hood to lock down its usage in the environment. And there's lots of features here. The first one that I see a lot of folks use is the execution policy. And what the execution policy defines is, can I run signed code in my environment, unsigned code? And when I try to run a PowerShell script, it's basically going to check this execution policy before it allows the code to run. And there's countless ways to bypass this technique. So I see a lot of folks say, hey, if the script came from the internet, I don't want it to be able to run in my environment unless it's signed. And the problem with that approach is that, I can call PowerShell with the execution policy flag, and I can tell it, hey, bypass the execution policy, get around that with just invocation of PowerShell itself. It doesn't mean it's useless. I still like to see it, and I still like to see it for forcing proper behavior among internal IT teams, where, I can have PowerShell is used by blue teams, PowerShell is used by sysadmins, maybe developers are using it as part of their build and release processes. And I like to see it facilitated in a way that, we can encourage those folks to do things like code signing with our internal PKI. And we can set the execution policy to say, hey, if it's a script, it's got to be signed. And we'll use our application control tool to say the code signing authority in my environment is allowed to execute scripts. And what that allows folks to do is first ensure kind of quality of that code, right? It's got to go through some build and release to get signed. And, I can't just push code that's going to brick a bunch of systems without going through that process. And so that's why I like the execution policy, even though I don't consider it really a valid security control. The other one I like to see is the language mode. And the PowerShell language mode gives us the ability to define what functionality is available to PowerShell sessions. And the really cool thing about this is that the language mode can integrate with tools like App Locker or application control tools. And you might have seen this in your event logs where you start up PowerShell and you see this really randomly named PowerShell script executing out of a temp directory. And I've seen folks who come to me like, hey, I'm totally owned. This random PowerShell script's executing every time I open my console. And it's actually native behavior of the platform to look for application control tools. So if App Locker or whatever your application control tool blocks a random PowerShell script executing out of a temporary folder, which it should, then PowerShell will automatically go into constrained language mode. And when you put PowerShell into constrained language mode, it limits things like the .NET types you can use in the background. And it really puts a lot of restrictions around the capabilities of that platform. And so, there's this really great combination of application control. I can define what scripts can run in my environment. And then I can also control PowerShell's capabilities with that tool set. And take some testing, right? There might be admins who need certain functionality that won't quite work right with constrained language mode. But as a general rule, if I have like an HR PC, I probably want that thing running in constrained language mode whenever it's not one of my endpoint admins. And so we can use that to really limit the damage that can be done to us with PowerShell in terms of the functionality we present to it. And then the last thing I'll say on that note is PowerShell logging used to be atrocious. It used to be really ugly, and attackers figured this out, I think, before us blue teamers did, that this is an awesome platform. It's native everywhere. I can interact with .NET and do whatever I want to this target machine. And oh, by the way, the blue team can't see any of this that I'm doing on the system. And with modern versions of PowerShell, we have much, much better logging capabilities. Everything from module logging and script block logging to full transcription of the sessions that we can use to really, when it gets abused, because it will, all the preventive controls are going to fail eventually. When it gets abused against us, we now have logs that we can go back, detect, and respond to that abuse.
Yeah, there's a whole lot of kind of detail and nuance there in terms of the types of logs and things that people can capture. You mentioned module logs, script block logs, transcript logs. Can you speak a little bit about the requirements for a blue team to be able to even get those logs in the first place, and then maybe which of those they would want? Obviously, the answer would be all three if possible, but where would you prioritize and how would you orchestrate collection of those things?
In terms of if I'm starting fresh, I know my blue team needs this visibility. I don't know if it's there yet or not. Generally, if I'm like a Windows-centric environment and I have something like group policy, I can set up a GPO that says, hey, for PowerShell logging, turn on, like you said, module script block logging, transcription. And really, it depends. Module logging is going to give you some output. And one fun thing that I like to show in Sec 586 is a Bash Bunny payload. So a Bash Bunny weaponized USB keyboard that you plug in, and it dumps Chrome credentials. And one cool thing that you can see with the module logging is the output of that command. So you can see like not just what the Bash Bunny was executing on that target, but also some of the output. And I've seen this work really well where malicious code executes. We have module logging. We see some of the output that was happening, and it gives us context around, what was that attacker trying to do? If it's heavily obfuscated code they're running, it's going to take me a little bit to kind of reverse that back to something usable and understandable. But I have the output right there. I can see kind of what they were going after based on the output. And then the script block logging, like you mentioned, gives us the ability to kind of see what's actually happening under the hood. What is going on in the system. And then transcription, is this kind of text-based logging that just gives us text files showing us these sessions that have occurred on the system, showing input and output.
So if you're trying to orchestrate a detection based on those things, are you centrally collecting those logs? Because I know some of those things can be really high volume. The transcripts are like text files. What would you do like as a blue team in terms of actually making those things usable from producing them to getting them, to the SOC?
Yeah, sure. So, if you use something like Windows Event Forwarding, or you have a SIM agent on all your endpoints that's pushing all that data back up to the SIM, pull from the channel that has those logs in it, and we can centralize it. Like you mentioned, it can be high volume. I would definitely recommend, understanding what that volume is before you blow up the SIM by just pointing all of your workstations at it. But it really depends. If your IT teams are using PowerShell for a lot of their normal operations, yeah, maybe that is going to be extremely high volume. But you'd be surprised. Some workstations, if you see really anything other than a handful of normal operations, that alone can be a detect that PowerShell is being used on that system.
What about the other kind of invocations of PowerShell for performing evil, right? Like a lot of times you see attackers will connect to a system, they're on PowerShell.exe with a long, chain of stuff, right? What is it about those kind of commands, PowerShell command line invocation commands that you can use to maybe spot from that angle that something bad is happening?
And one other reason PowerShell is so important and useful to attackers is that it enables like a whole series of fileless type attacks, right? I don't have to push down an executable to the target and execute it. I can, like you mentioned, use an encoded base64 command that's packaged as part of my PowerShell invocation to execute whatever I want without ever touching disk if I choose to. And one thing that I like to do is kind of baseline that normal PowerShell operations. When I'm looking at whether it's Windows Event 4688, I'm looking at new process creations with full command line auditing enabled. If it's that data, I like to say, hey, show me every time PowerShell is executed, and then give me an understanding of what the normal length of that execution is. And it's super simple to just calculate this. And again, you can do it with PowerShell, of course, calculate that length, and then understand if we see one where we have an encoded command passed, and that length is some number greater than whatever our average or our normal is, we know we have a deviation from a normal baseline, and we can take a closer look at that.
Beyond length, what other strategies might you use for that sort of a thing?
Yeah, so there's lots of other cool techniques, and really attackers have figured out it's got to be most of the ways to kind of obfuscate PowerShell execution to kind of stay under the radar. And one of the tools I love is Eric Conrad's Deep Blue CLI. And it's a PowerShell-based tool that has a lot of these detects based, baked right into it. And he does a lot of things like, look for, if I'm setting the execution policy when I call PowerShell, I can pass it as execution policy, or I can pass it as EP, or any number of variations of those parameter names. And so we can look for, again, I don't like to look for kind of that signature of some variant that I know about. I'd rather say this is what normal PowerShell looks like in my environment, and anything outside of that norm, whether it's execution policy in some variant of that format or an encoded command that I'm not expecting in my environment. And I try to turn the detection around to say, hey, just show me anything that's outside of normal.
Yeah, I like that approach a lot. One of the things I'm always saying in classes is like, not every anomaly is malicious, but everything malicious is an anomaly in some way if you can cut up the data and display it as such to highlight it that it is an anomaly. And so I think there's a lot of different opportunities for that. When you can see the full length of everything that's been typed on a PowerShell command line, or if you can see all the invocations on a process creation log with all the arguments and everything like that. There's a lot of really interesting ways that people have gone about it. And yeah, like you said, Deep Blue CLI, great tool for that sort of thing. A lot of really interesting stuff to cover there. I want to get to one other aspect of PowerShell before we run out of time. And that is as we kind of mentioned a little bit before, some of the automation and integration capabilities of it and how you've seen it used in maybe more operational aspects. I know you've done some stuff with Jupyter notebooks in PowerShell, which is not something I've really seen a whole lot of. Can you describe what you're doing in that realm?
Yeah. So the inspiration for this for me was kind of working with folks in SOCs and watching what they do day in, day out, and how their operations or what portions of those operations we can automate and streamline. And it's certainly gotten better over the years, but take like a phishing attack example. My SOC folks are jumping in and they're taking that URL that's in an email and they're sandboxing it, and they're doing domain lookups on, understanding context around the site, the domain, how it came in, where it came from. And so much of that when I'd watch and just sit and watch these folks work is something that we can automate. And SOAR tools have done a great job in kind of speeding up this kind of incident detection to context gathering and data gathering and aggregation. But what I like to do is use something like a Jupyter notebook or now a VS Code notebook to give those kind of entry-level folks the tooling and the automation they need, and they don't necessarily have to understand how it's working under the hood. And I love this aspect of Jupyter specifically and now VS Code notebooks, that I can tie together documentation and executable code all in the same platform. And so I can say, hey, here's a notebook. This is going to describe how you respond to a phishing incident. And my analysts can open that up. They can read it. They can read through all the procedures and understand, what we're doing, but they don't necessarily have to understand how the code under the hood is functioning. And what I like to do is basically have documentation up front that says, hey, here's what we're going to do. Here's what I need you as an analyst to look out for. And right, we want to prioritize those human minds on the things that the human minds do best for a blue team. And that's definitely not like opening up a sandbox tool and typing in a URL. It's analyzing the output of that. And so we'll kind of set that stage up front. And then basically we'll have a code section right underneath that says, hey, here is a setup section. Put in the URL that you're interested in here. We're going to call VirusTotal with it later on, or whatever other sandbox utilities we use. We'll make those API calls with the PowerShell that follows. But here's just a setup section. And, maybe we'll put some API keys in there or go call our CyberArks or whatever our secret management tools are to go get those keys. And that's a setup section that person can kind of build out. And again, they don't have to understand the mechanics of the language, but then they can press play and it'll execute that code, and that PowerShell will be ready to run down the line. And then the next section they'll get to will say, hey, sandbox this. And again, they just click play. The code's already written there for them. They click play and it goes and pulls back, what is VirusTotal or whatever other data source we want to pull from. What does it say about this URL? Is it already known malicious? What does my proxy categorize this URL as? That's something I see a lot of folks. They go to a web page and look up. Well, now I just press play inside my notebook and it shows me right here. And then I have the ability to, via the markdown driven kind of documentation side of things, annotate what I'm finding. So I'm an analyst. I can say, hey, this looks suspicious because this phishing URL shows up as, banking or health and wellness, and I don't decrypt those at the border, and therefore maybe I need to take a second look at what might have been included in this payload. And so the ability to kind of tie that documentation and that executable code together, I find just saves a ton of time and then helps them learn under the hood. Like, okay, I'm just an interested blue teamer. I want to learn more PowerShell or Python or whatever the language is. I want to learn more about how the mechanics of that work. Well, the code's right there. I can just read it and kind of Google and and follow along as I execute it.
Yeah, that stuff is really, really cool. And the more I read kind of about what people are doing that are really kind of on the forefront of research and trying to optimize workflow and everything in blue teams, the more I see that kind of pattern is like, let's take a notebook, let's put the code and the playbook kind of together as one and work through the whole thing with documentation and action actually being taken from each of those steps. So I'm really, really happy to see PowerShell going in that direction too. I think that's definitely the future of where blue team and automation is kind of converging and going. Final question for PowerShell. What do you see happening in the future? Are there any like tools or features that have just been released that are really opening up the possibilities to go in new directions that are not super explored yet? Or what are you excited about coming up?
That's a great question. I think I'm most excited about the cross-platform direction that the PowerShell project is moving in. Right. I've always had these awesome capabilities on Windows. Now I need that on my Linux gear. And the platform itself is moving in that direction, which is really providing this kind of centralized tool set for blue teams to have this code base that we can execute regardless of the target operating system. So as a platform, I think that's probably what is the most exciting to me. In terms of implementation, what I'm seeing folks do a much better job of these days than I have in the past is things like restricting full administrative rights to systems. And one trend that I've seen, and I really hope it continues, is the usage of GIA, just enough administration within PowerShell. And I've had many use cases where folks are like, look, I need my help desk to have full admin to every workstation so that they can restart this one service when it fails. And, then a help desk account gets popped, and now we have an incident that is spanning the entire environment. And what I love to see folks doing is moving towards something like Gia, where that admin doesn't need to know, or doesn't need any administrative function beyond restarting that service or whatever it might be. And so we can say, hey, build a PowerShell remoting profile that implements Gia, and we give this Active Directory group that is our help desk the ability to, using PowerShell remoting, log into this target system and restart the service. They can only run the specific command that we allow them to, and we can even scope it to say they can only run this command with this specific parameter value. And so, you can only restart the backup agent on the system if you're a help desk admin. And it gives them the ability to do exactly what they need to do, but nothing more. And I've seen this just kind of, working with folks in many different organizations, many different industries. I've seen this kind of spiraling in terms of its adoption, that folks don't want that those admin privileges anymore. They don't want to be the person who's like, oh yeah, I clicked that link and then my account was the one that was used. All I needed to do was restart the backup agent. And so I'm kind of finding, also from a DevOps perspective, right? Developers have longed for more access to their infrastructure where their systems are running, where their applications are running. And I feel like this is the perfect way to give them exactly what they want, exactly what they need to better run their operations without increasing the risk to that back-end operating system, more than we really have to.
There's a whole world of stuff that's out there with PowerShell, and I'm glad we got to hit on a bunch of that stuff today. Very, very cool kind of technology, and the control mechanisms and all that stuff seem like they're there as long as people know to use them and how to use them in a great way. Where can we go to learn more about this sort of thing? I know that this is one of those topics, we said it could be expanded over days. Where can we find your information online and kind of more resources for people who want to learn more about PowerShell?
Yeah, so I'll share my information. Twitter, LinkedIn, I'm JCJohnson34. That's my GitHub as well. Feel free to reach out. I can point folks in directions to open free resources. And then on the other hand, there's this new class that's coming out at SANS Sec 586. This class launched as a 3-day class originally, and the feedback was overwhelmingly positive and in a good way. Everyone was like, we want more. And so we're launching this as a 6-day class in June. It's Sec 586, Blue Team Operations Defensive PowerShell. And really, we touched on a handful of things that we dive really, really deep into in terms of Sec 586. So, that class is coming in June. I'm really, really excited to launch it. And I hope that I can, just see, like I've seen Gia kind of spiraling out of control. I want to make an army of like Blue Team PowerShell ninjas that can just go fight bad guys using PowerShell as the weapon.
Fantastic. Well, best of luck to you on the course. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. You had a ton of very actionable information here. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure that our listeners are really going to enjoy this episode too. So thank you so much for sharing all that with us. And anyone who's interested, go check out that course, brand new information and deep dive on this sort of thing. So thanks so much for being on the podcast, Josh. I will catch you later.
Thanks, John.
Hey, Blue Teamers. I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Blueprint. If you've got a second and want to help support the podcast, please subscribe and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. It would be really, really meaningful to us. And if you have any ideas or suggestions, I would love to hear them. Your reviews are going to be one of the best ways to help others find this podcast. So anything you could do would be a big help. As always, thank you for listening. You can connect to me on social at SecHub, SECHUBB on Twitter or on LinkedIn. So until next time, thank you for listening to the Blueprint Podcast.